Are you looking for the fastest and easiest way to clean out your pellet grill? Well, today on Separate Food Barbecue, I'm gonna show you how I did this. That 2-second clip alone is enough for you to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now let me show you how I did it.
So I started off with just cleaning the heat deflector and the searing grate. I wanted to make sure it was free of grease and built up gunk so that when I'm handling it I don't slip and maybe hurt myself. After a good cleaning, the first step for the Pit Boss Pro 1100 is to cut off these little nubs that go into the slots on the heat deflector. Flip it over, cut them both off. And when you finish that cut, you want to run the grinder over top of it to kind of smooth it out as much as possible. Alright, so now I put my searing grate back on the heat deflector and positioned it in what would be the closed position, and used a screwdriver to kind of just score the surface of the heat deflector so I knew where that searing grate sat when it was closed. Now obviously my access port would have to be smaller than that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking through right now. So I ran to the big box store and picked up these 2-inch hinges. I really was looking for stainless steel, but I couldn't find any, so these will have to do. I went ahead and placed them where they were going to be once I made the cuts. I used the back line of those searing holes to make sure it was nice and square. I just eyeballed it. And I marked the 4 spots on each hinge where the bolts would go through. Once I had my 8 spots marked out, I grabbed a metal drill bit and drilled out the 8 holes. With the 8 holes drilled out, the next step was to draw out the actual cutting lines for my access hatch. I used a straight edge and eyeballed right in between the 4 holes for each hinge and marked the heat deflector with a screwdriver. And I followed up with a marker just to be certain I could see the line. On the front side of the access hatch, I just eyeballed roughly the same distance from the searing slots that I did in the back and drew another line. For the curved parts, I brought out the searing plate and I used it as a straight edge to draw the lines, making sure that they were inside the original lines I drew that marked the closed position. So what I decided to do was draw my lines right through the center of the slots where the searing plate would normally ride inside. It ended up working really well for me. Alright, so there you can see the square that I'm going to end up cutting out here in the next couple steps. But before we do that, we have one more hole to drill. I picked up this piece of flat stock from the big box store. Just gonna eyeball where I want it to go. And this will just make sure the access hatch stays in the proper position when it's closed. Since the position of this piece isn't super critical, I didn't mark it with a marker. I just touched it lightly with my metal drill bit, and then drilled it through. Alright, with that last hole completed, it's time to move on to the fun part. Let's make some sparks. Now but listen, in all seriousness, this hand grinder, or angle grinder, is a very dangerous tool. You see I got some gloves on, I'm wearing eye protection and some ear protection as well. If you haven't used one of these before, it's very torquey and has a tendency to jump right out of your hand. They typically come with a handle attached to it, right about where I have my left hand. But the person I borrowed this from no longer had that handle, so I held it carefully and tightly and took my time with these cuts just to make sure I didn't have an accident and cut off one of my fingers. Now if you can't get your hands on one of these angle grinders, alternatively you could have used the metal drill bit to drill the corners of this square out, and then used like a metal cutting blade on a jigsaw maybe and cut through it. Luckily I had a friend who had this and let me borrow it, so I think this is much easier and quicker. Now once this piece actually cuts off, it's still very sharp on the edges. I have a metal cutoff disc on my angle grinder, which typically isn't used for grinding the way I'm using it now, but it did a pretty good job of just smoothing out the edges for me so they weren't sharp. Alright, now that all the grinding's done, it's time to put this thing together. I started off by attaching the hinges to the axis port. You just want to put these on finger tight. You want to leave a little bit of looseness in those bolts to make sure everything lines up good. These are the stainless steel bolts that I was able to pick up at the big box store. Just make sure that the bolts fit through the hinge and that you're also using a drill bit that's the right size for the bolts. Alright, I flipped it over to get the last 4 bolts in. Again, everything's just finger tight right now. I want to make sure it works pretty well. Last thing is to install that latch that holds it in the right position. And now that everything's working smoothly, I'll just go ahead and tighten up all these bolts. Alright, with the install complete, let's put the searing plate on and see how it looks. It works. Right away I've noticed these gaps on the side. Now after cooking with it 2 or 3 times, I didn't have any issues, but I thought I'd try to reposition the hinges so that we can minimize this gap that you're seeing right here. My concern is that perhaps too much heat is entering the pit area from that gap. So I decided to try to fix it. I thought if I flipped the hinges onto the inside of the heat deflector, that would solve my problem. But as you're seeing in the video here, no matter which orientation I tried to put them in, the axis panel just wouldn't line up correctly with the hinges on the inside. I'm not a hinge expert, so I don't know what's happening, but all I know is I had to put it back the way it was when I originally installed it. So just to make sure it's clear, this is how the hinges were left after I tried fixing them, quote unquote fixing them. It leaves the axis panel right in the center of my cut line and an even gap around the whole thing. Again, I've already cooked with the pit 2 or 3 times since I've made this modification and haven't really noticed any difference in temperatures. So I think we're good. Alright, and this is how you clean out your pit right before you start. All you got to do is lift up this center grate and put it aside. Then you're going to want to pull your searing grate out of the way. lift up that access port and clean out the ash pot. It's that easy. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more unique barbecue videos from Semperfu Barbecue. If you want to learn more about your pit, here's a playlist you can watch that teaches you more about flame out, P settings, and everything else you need to know. And here's a video YouTube thinks you would like. Thanks for watching.